From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Sculptor's Funeral, straight out of Florence, Italy, where all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself. And I hope everyone had a great holiday, and I hope your new year got started with a bang. I thought I would start off the new year here at The Sculptor's Funeral with an episode dedicated to the sculptor whose career marks the line between the Italian Renaissance and everything that came after, ushering in a new era of sculpture whose style would dominate for a full century in most of Europe. And of course, I could only be talking about Gianlorenzo Bernini. Now, Bernini was one of the greatest sculptors in history. He may have been the most talented and skilled sculptor ever to carve marble. I know that's a matter of opinion, but in my book, I can think of no one who ever worked with the virtuosity and variety that Bernini did. And if that were all Bernini accomplished in his lifetime, supreme virtuosity, then he would be deserving of a podcast episode for that alone. But there's so much more to him. His technical skills might be one of the less interesting things about him. He has the eclecticism of a Donatello, the intellect of a Michelangelo, the business acumen and technical skill of Giambologna, and on top of that, he is an example of the idea of the Renaissance man, a creative polymath who excelled in many fields of pursuit, from architecture and sculpture to painting and even caricature, a genre of drawing that he helped to invent, to theatrical design. He directed celebrations and festivals, he wrote plays, he constructed set design and interior decoration, and beyond that, Bernini managed to expand the scope of the nature of sculpture itself, experimenting in ways in which sculpture can interact with its viewer and its environment, interact with time as well as space, and even interact with itself by way of multi-layered realities that he created in his sculptures. Now, even an introduction to Bernini deserves a two-part podcast. He's just that significant. So this podcast episode will cover the basic biography of his life, as well as explain his early achievements, which influenced successive generations of sculptors and still resonate today. Next week, we'll delve into some of his later works, which typify various other aspects of Baroque sculpture, which Bernini initiated and others followed. Gianlorenzo Bernini was born in 1598 to the minor Mannerist sculptor Pietro Bernini. Now, Pietro was from Florence, but was working in Naples at the time of Gianlorenzo's birth. And to put that time in context, Giambologna, the leading Mannerist sculptor and greatest sculptor since Michelangelo, was by that time an old man, although still very active professionally. The influence of Giambologna's work had spread throughout Europe by this time, and it had many imitators. Pietro Bernini himself was a native Florentine and knew Giambologna, but had trained under another fairly minor sculptor there in Florence, and was a competent but rather ordinary talent. Now, Pietro Bernini traveled to Rome and then to Naples and found steady work there. The family then moved back to Rome fairly permanently in 1605 or 1606, when Gianlorenzo was about 8 years old. Pietro found work at the Vatican and other papal projects at a time when the papacy was starting to redesign and update the major churches in the area. So the young Bernini grew up amid the atmosphere of the sculptor's studio, as well as being exposed to leading patrons of the time. Now, like many great artists, he seems to have been in the right place at the right time from a very early age. And also, like many great artists, there are the usual stories of the young Gianlorenzo's precociousness and talents manifesting themselves early on. But with Bernini, we can actually believe those stories because there is tangible proof in the form of statuary that Bernini carved practically as a child. Bernini had several sculptures in marble under his belt by the time he was 17 years old. Now, this was possible not only through Bernini's natural talents, but also by the fact that Bernini, the son of an active sculptor, had the earliest possible apprenticeship under ideal circumstances, as well as a loving and generous father who encouraged Bernini's talents and successes, and even gladly took a back seat to his son when the young Bernini's star began its fantastic ascent only a few years later. Now, we don't know how much of these early works which were mostly sculptures of putti, or, baby angels. We don't know how much those works were the young Bernini's creation in terms of design, or how much assistance he had in carving them from his dad, but it is known that father and son, the elder and the younger Bernini, often collaborated. Not only did Gianlorenzo assist his father's works, but the first major statues that the young Bernini carved were collaborations with his father. Pietro Bernini was by no means a gifted artist, but he knew one when he saw one, and was more than happy to use his own skills and knowledge as a solid craftsman to give his son an ideal start in his career. So while Bernini's father was obviously Bernini's first major influence, it was through his father that he was introduced to the work of Giambologna and Michelangelo, and also works of antiquity. And it is to the credit of Bernini that even with this fantastic start handed to him on a platter, he actively pushed himself to learn even more and work harder and be a better artist and craftsman at every opportunity. His youth, talents, and dedication brought him to the notice of cardinals and even the Pope, Paul V. In his early teens, Bernini drew the Pope's portrait right in front of the Pope, and it impressed the Pope so much that he commanded a cardinal, a man by the name of Maffeo Barberini, to supervise and provide for the young man's education and training. According to one source, the Pope stated, quote, "We hope that this youth will become the Michelangelo of this century." So we're going to hear much more about this Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, the caretaker of Bernini's education. We're going to hear about him later, as he was to figure greatly in Bernini's life. In Bernini's earliest works, classical subjects were often the themes chosen, just as it had been in Giambologna's or Michelangelo's youth. Work done in the antique style were popular and saleable, and were also acknowledged as one of the prime sources from which a sculptor should draw influence. Now, interestingly, it was with religious subjects that Bernini seems to show, still in his teens, just how well he could render the human form using a living model. Now, his small-scale marble works, there are two of them. One is called Saint Sebastian, and the other one is Saint Lawrence. And if you saw these two works, they'll seem a bit familiar, I think, to many sculptors listening to the podcast, because they're your sort of standard examples of advanced student work. They're primarily figure studies, but they're given a theme and a few props, and that kind of turns the figure study into a sculpture. So, St. Lawrence, it's a reclining nude, but, Bernini's placed him on a flaming grill, so that turns it from a nude figure study into a sculpture. But the wonderfully naturalistic rendering of each of these figures, it illustrates Bernini's mastery of the human form above and beyond working in the antique style. Now, at the same time, these small works show that Bernini was looking at Michelangelo and other Renaissance masters. As is necessarily the case with all great masters, the ambition to learn from, compete with, and then best the masters of the past is evident in Bernini's teenage work. And in the St. Lawrence and in the St. Sebastian, we see Bernini at this sort of learning stage, emulating poses and facial types of Michelangelo, but seeming to come up with something new rather than something completely derivative. Now, Bernini's opportunity to really show off his talents and training on a larger scale came when he was just 19. Impressed by these early studies, the Cardinal Scipione Borghese, the nephew to Pope Paul V, commissioned a life-size sculpture group with an antique theme. Cardinal Borghese had a new palace built, and he was now outfitting it with a bunch of art, although he himself was not to move in for several years. And although this work was a collaboration with his father, Bernini was at the lead of this work. It was really his work. Now, the theme of the figure group is The Flight from Troy, and it's a 3-figure group, and it's related to similar 3-figure groups, victory groups of Giambologna. It owes much, of course, to the Rape of the Sabine. But the similarities between the two sculptures are, in fact, few. First off, the work isn't designed to be equally seen from all sides like your typical Mannerist sculpture is, because it didn't have to be. You see, the sculpture's position against a wall in the cardinal's palace was already sort of predetermined. They knew where it was going to go. It was going to go against a wall, so why design it to be seen equally from all sides? And although two of the figures in Bernini's work are assuming variations of La Figura Serpentinata, the twisting pose, which so characterizes Giambologna and the late Mannerists, it's obvious that, unlike with Giambologna, there's a lot more going on in the work than mere bravura composition. Now, the Flight from Troy depicts the hero of Virgil's poem, the Aeneid, and the hero of the poem is Aeneas, and he's carrying off his aged father right on his shoulder, with his young son in tow as they flee the burning city of Rome. Now, this three-generation grouping of grandfather, father, and son is a reflection upon the popular antique theme of the three ages of man, right? And Bernini uses the theme to show off his versatility in carving the soft forms of boyhood, the idealized figure of manhood, and then the sagging, sort of wrinkled skin of old age. Bernini is now showing that he can not only improve upon formal ideas of Giambologna and Michelangelo, but that he is more than simply a Mannerist. He can combine a classical theme and its necessary idealism with lifelike naturalism in a way that hadn't yet been done. What's more, he proved that he could use his already virtuoso skills in a tasteful way that was neither show-offish or ignorant. Right? It was exactly the sort of statue that Cardinal Borghese was hoping for. And when you get exactly what you want, the next thing you do is you commission more of the same. So Bernini had been ordered to carve more work for the Cardinal, who was determined to keep Bernini's remarkable talents in his own service. He didn't want to share Bernini. And in 1621, at the tender age of 23 years old, Bernini was commissioned to carve a work representing Pluto, the king of the underworld, carrying off Proserpina, known in English commonly as Persephone. And the group is called Pluto and Persephone. And before that work was done, the cardinal ordered two more statues, a statue of David, a theme from the Bible, and a group of Apollo and Daphne from Greek myth. Now, these four statues, the Flight from Troy, Pluto and Persephone, Apollo and Daphne, and David, were all of them done in just a span of 5 or 6 years. During that time, he had a bunch of other work besides, including a life-size Neptune and several portrait busts. It's quite a feat that he was able to complete all these works in such a short span of time. I mean, he had a bunch of assistants, of course, and you would think that his heavy workload might mean that the quality of his work might leave a little to be desired. Quite the opposite. In fact, these 4 large statues that he carved for Cardinal Borghese aren't merely good. They are amazingly good. And they're good in a way that is different from all other sculpture before them. Later historians and scholars have described the Borghese statue as inaugurating a new era in the history of European sculpture, and as a manifesto of a totally new style. And he did it all by the time he was 26. Now, Bernini's new style and radically different sensibility would, in his lifetime, be emulated by sculptors all around Europe, and this new style of sculpture would be called Baroque. Now, what do we refer to when we call a sculpture Baroque? What does Baroque mean? And what differentiates it from Renaissance sculpture or Mannerist sculpture? Well, first, let's look at the idea of Baroque in general. Now, the word Baroque, it applies to a movement in all the arts, which seems to have started right around 1600, and it's in painting, music, architecture, poetry, as well as sculpture. Now, the foundational ideas of the Baroque movement in art came in part from a conscious effort on behalf of the Catholic Church to use art to appeal directly to the masses of Europe, who were in danger of being lost by the Church to Protestantism. Now, at the Council of Trent in the 1550s, which was a council organized by the church leaders to reform the Catholic Church in the face of Protestantism, at this council it was recognized that the Church could and should offer an artistic counter-argument to the elite intellectual Neoplatonists and humanists and their educated artists who strove to emulate the calm rationality and order of pagan Greek sculpture. People in the Catholic Church realized that the majority of the people of Europe, uneducated in the classics, could be more easily reached through a more populist form of art. And like populist art of any time period, it needed to be catchy, right? It needed to be simple, direct, clever, pleasing in an uncomplicated way, and above all, impressive. Maybe even boisterous, exuberant, flamboyant, elaborate. Each of these descriptors fits the notions of the Baroque. The word Baroque, by the way, it has its roots in several languages, and it means an irregular pearl. Now, the idea behind that is that an irregular pearl, while of great beauty and value, is also non-conventional, surprising, unique, and unexpected. And that kind of sums up what the Baroque was all about. Now, this shift from the overwrought intellectualism of mannerism into something more direct and grand and sort of in-your-face, it kind of happened first in painting, with artists like Caravaggio, whose starkly lit paintings often center upon a heightened emotional state of its subjects, rather than alluding to more esoteric or allegorical themes. The Carracci brothers, if you remember, they opened up the first private teaching institution in Bologna. The Carracci brothers were also in line with the idea of a populist art form, and their paintings also reflect a heroic quality that is visceral rather than intellectual. Now, Bernini, a man of his time, he intuited these themes and ideas of the Baroque, as well as the desires of his patrons, and produced a set of sculptures for Cardinal Borghese that espouse many of the core principles of the Baroque, and were some of the earliest to do so. Now, I'm going to discuss in particular the merits of these 4 sculptures a little bit later in the podcast, but for the time being, all you need to know about them is that they are a departure into something new, they're fantastically well done, and that by the time they were finished, Bernini was recognized as the greatest sculptor in Europe by those who knew what they were talking about. Now, we'll continue with his biography in a moment. Many sculptors and sculpture fans listening will be familiar with the works I'm discussing today, but many will not. If you are not, just go to the website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, and in the episode gallery of this podcast, you'll find many images that are relevant to today's discussion. While you're at thesculptorsfuneral.com, you can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. You can listen to every episode of The Sculptor's Funeral for free, and you can leave a comment or ask a question. All right, before the break, I mentioned that after Bernini had finished this series of sculptures for Cardinal Scipione Borghese, Bernini was recognized as a supreme master of his craft and was highly sought after. He was even knighted in 1621 by then Pope Gregory XV, and from then on he was known as Cavaliere Bernini. And just a few years before he finished his work for Cardinal Borghese, something occurred that would catapult Bernini into some of the most ambitious and original commissions a sculptor was ever fortunate enough to receive. Remember I mentioned another cardinal, a Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, who was appointed to safeguard the training and education of the young Bernini? Well, Cardinal Barberini and Bernini became fast friends, despite their age difference. And it's probably from the erudite Cardinal Barberini that Bernini learned so much about art history and theory and aesthetics. Well, in 1623, Pope Gregory XV died, and Cardinal Maffeo Barberini is elected to be the new pope, taking the name of Urban VIII. "It is your great fortune, Cavaliere," the new pope is quoted as saying, "to see Cardinal Maffeo Barberini made pope. But our fortune is far greater in that Cavaliere Bernini lives during our pontificate." So here you've got Pope Urban VIII telling Bernini how lucky he, the Pope, feels to have Bernini around during his papacy. Urban VIII was Pope for 21 years, and during that time, the relationship between sculptor and Pope was one of the most fruitful collaborations of immense ambition, immense talent, and immense wealth the world has known. Bernini enjoyed unquestioned supremacy as an artist in Rome, and upon that city he left an indelible imprint in sculpture and architecture. And speaking of architecture, although I won't go into much detail about Bernini the Architect, it is important to note how vital this dual role of sculptor and architect was to Bernini's later work, and to the notions of Baroque sculpture itself. Much of Bernini's work is motivated by the idea of the total work of art. That is, the incorporation into a sculpted work, considerations of architecture, lighting, color, atmosphere, everything within visual reach of the sculpture itself. In some of Bernini's later sculptures, it's difficult to determine where the sculpture ends and the architecture begins. I'll be talking a lot more about this idea of the total work of art in the Part 2 episode next week, but for now I'll just mention it in passing, as it is with Bernini's first commission for Pope Urban VIII that Bernini starts to explore architectural possibilities. So anyway, during the 2 decades or so that Urban VIII was Pope, Bernini assumed many official positions of power over the art and architecture of Rome. He oversaw refurbishments of churches and the construction of new ones, but by far his most prominent position was that of architect for St. Peter's. St. Peter's, of course, is the church. It is the seat of the Roman Catholic religion, said to be founded upon the site of the Apostle Peter's martyrdom. The Apostle Peter was the first pope. So yeah, it's a pretty important church. Now, St. Peter's, as Bernini knew it, was only recently completed. The dome, designed by Michelangelo, had just been finished a few years before Bernini's birth, but there was still much to be done on the interior of this enormous church, as well as the huge piazza out in front of the church itself. Bernini's work was cut out for him. One of the first tasks was to design the enormous baldacchino, which is this huge bronze canopy which shields the shrine and tomb of St. Peter right at the heart of the church, right at the crossing. So much bronze was required for the baldacchino that they ended up stripping the bronze roof of the ancient Roman Pantheon, leading some to remark that what the barbarians started, the Barberini completed. Barberini, if you remember, is the family name of Pope Urban VIII. So the baldacchino was incredibly large and elaborate and expensive. How expensive, you ask? Well, the baldacchino ate up a full 10% of the entire annual budget of the Papal States for 9 years. So it's pretty expensive. Now, if you can't imagine how a bronze canopy could cost so much, then you probably haven't seen it, or at least haven't seen it in person. It's almost so huge, to look at a picture, it's hard to get a sense of the scale. And it's impossible to exaggerate the sheer scale of the interior of St. Peter's. The baldacchino, it's almost 70 feet tall, or 20 meters tall, right? So basically, imagine a bronze sculpture as large as a building. Bernini also designed 4 large sculptures of saints for the crossing of the church, though he himself carved only one of them. He designed and sculpted various side chapels and decorative elements of the nave, the ciborium, and a whole lot more. Not least, just 4 years into his pontificate, Pope Urban VIII commissioned Bernini to start work on the Pope's own tomb, which ended up taking 20 years to complete. And all the work going on at St. Peter's happened simultaneously with a ton of other work for Bernini. Portrait busts, memorials, allegorical statuary, even a few fountains during this time. And even with all that was going on, Bernini still found time to create a single portrait bust that stands out amongst his works as being one of the only sculptures he created in his maturity that wasn't a commission, but rather a personal work. And this was the portrait of Costanza Piccolomini Bonarelli. Costanza Bonarelli was the wife of one of Bernini's assistants. Costanza was from a noble Roman family and was very beautiful. Bernini, for his part, was handsome, powerful, rich, and in 1636, at the age of 38, he was also single. Bernini fell in love with Costanza. He made the portrait, and he made her his mistress. Now, Bernini had been known to take lovers before, but it appears that he was absolutely passionate for Costanza. And it doesn't seem like he cared who knew about it either. And his affair was generally known in town, presumably to even Costanza's husband. But then, one morning, Bernini caught another man coming out of Costanza's house, where that man had apparently spent the night, and that man was Bernini's own brother, Luigi Bernini, another sculptor. Enraged, Bernini chased his brother through the streets of Rome, finally catching up with him right in St. Peter's itself, where Bernini proceeded to beat his brother with an iron bar, breaking several ribs. He probably would have killed him if he hadn't been pulled off by other people. It was a despicable display, to be sure, but worse was to come. Bernini was so enraged at his mistress cheating on him with his brother, Bernini sent one of his servants to slash and disfigure Costanza's face with a razor. Now, this entire affair, of course, went to trial, and the servant who slashed Costanza's face was sent into exile. Bernini himself was just sentenced to pay a fine, which the Pope later waived. So, Bernini got off scot-free. A little later, though, the Pope put pressure on Bernini to settle down and marry, and even had a wife selected for Bernini, a beautiful, docile woman half his age, which Bernini graciously accepted. She bore him 11 children, and they remained married for life, and Bernini apparently remained faithful. It's a horrible story, isn't it? It sort of reminds me of, kind of when a celebrity goes off the deep end, nowadays. Celebrities, and I guess you could count Bernini as one of them, I mean, they spend, much of their life being allowed to do whatever they want to do, and you keep pushing those boundaries, and you keep meeting no resistance when you push those boundaries, and until I imagine that you imagine that there really are no boundaries. Well, this violent end to Bernini's affair with Costanza Bonarelli seems to have been a wake-up call for Bernini, and was an episode which was not repeated during his life. By all accounts, Bernini grew very devout in his middle age, and remained so, even if he never lost his pride, his ambition, and his lust for glory. Having said that, Bernini's meteoric rise and good fortune could not last forever, and in 1644, when Bernini was 46 years old, Pope Urban VIII died. The next pope, Innocent X, who was from a family who were political rivals to Pope Urban VIII's family, had a different sensibility than his predecessor. He thought Urban VIII had been too lavish in spending on artistic and architectural projects. On top of that, maybe even perhaps because of it, Innocent X seems to have had a bit of a dislike for Bernini, and preferred Borromini, Bernini's closest thing to a rival he had in architecture. And right around this time, Bernini met with an actual setback, probably the first in his professional career. A tower that Bernini had designed for one end of St. Peter's had started to shift and crack, necessitating its demolition. Now, this delighted Bernini's detractors, who were made up mostly of architects and sculptors, who practically couldn't land a commission in Rome without Bernini's say-so. Bernini had so much power at this point. And Bernini was the best sculptor and a very fine architect, but he was not the only one in town. Nevertheless, Bernini remained the architect of St. Peter's until his death. And during the reigns of several popes after Urban VIII, Bernini completed several major undertakings for St. Peter's, including the Cathedra Petri, which is kind of a reliquary statue which contains the purported throne of St. Peter. And he also completed the iconic colonnaded piazza right out in front of St. Peter's. However, those magnificent works would only begin after Pope Innocent X's death in 1655, after having been pope for 11 years. So the exception to this rule, the one major papal commission that Bernini made during the pontificate of Innocent X, is the wonderful Fountain of Four Rivers in Piazza Navona in Rome. The fountain is comprised of 4 monumental scale allegories of the 4 major rivers of the world, the Danube, the Nile, the River Plate in South America, and also the Ganges. Now, these figures are seated on a fantastical sort of outcropping of rock, kind of like grotto figures often do, with various beasts cavorting in the sprays of water, and with an obelisk crowning the entire work. Now, this fountain, like most others in Rome, was in fact an elaborate and decorative well, a public water access for the people in Rome, as of course no one had indoor plumbing at this time. Innocent X wanted to curry favor with the populace by building this fountain. It's a stunning work, and it's regarded as Bernini's best fountain, and that's saying something. But how is it that the commission went to Bernini rather than to either of his rivals? There's Algardi, the sculptor, and Borromini, the architect, both of whom were preferred by Pope Innocent X. How did the commission go to Bernini, who Innocent disliked? Well, it's a funny story, actually. Innocent X held a competition for the design of the fountain, but it was a limited, closed competition, and Bernini was not invited to compete. However, Bernini did have supporters from within the family of the Pope, and thought Bernini should be the natural choice. And so a nephew of the Pope convinced Bernini to make a model of his fountain anyway, which Bernini did, and even had it cast in silver. And then another sympathetic member of the Pope's family had it placed in the family's palace, where it was soon to be discovered by Innocent X himself. Now, taken at surprise and delight by this unexpected and beautiful model, the Pope declared that this should be the winning design, even after he learned the identity of its author. He's famously quoted as saying of Bernini, "The only way to avoid executing his work is to not see them." So Bernini wasn't exactly twiddling his thumbs during the pontificate of Pope Innocent X. And the Pope was hardly the only patron in Rome. In lieu of new projects for St. Peter's, Bernini completed many works for various cardinals, family chapels, and religious orders all over Rome. One of these works stands out as preeminent during this time, and it is considered by many to be Bernini's masterpiece. It's known as the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. Saint Teresa of Avila was a Spanish nun who founded an order of Carmelite nuns, but what she is best known for was an autobiography that she had written and published, which detailed her many religious visions and visitations that she endured throughout her life. Many of these describe, in almost sexual detail, her interactions with archangels and with visions of Christ himself. It's kind of too juicy not to quote. Here's a typical passage. So, quoting from St. Teresa's autobiography, "He appeared to be one of the highest types of angel, who seemed to be all afire. In his hands I saw a long golden spear, and at the end of the iron tip I seemed to see a point of fire. With this he seemed to pierce my heart several times, so that it penetrated to my entrails. And when he drew it out, I thought he was drawing them out with it, and he left me completely afire for a great love of God. The pain was so sharp it made me utter several moans, and so excessive was the sweetness caused me by this intense pain that one can never wish to lose it, nor will one's soul be content with anything less than God." So with juicy stuff like this, naturally it was a bestseller. And Bernini took the task of rendering this very scene in marble. His solution was to allude to the passions of St. Teresa in the disheveled, fiery folds of drapery, which completely cover and hide her body, creating a sculpture that is both chaste and spiritual, but at the same time unnervingly erotic. The sculpture itself sits as the centerpiece of the Cornaro family chapel in Santa Maria della Vittoria, and the chapel is also designed by Bernini. And I'll talk about the sculpture and its chapel in the next podcast in more detail. By the time of the death of Pope Innocent X, Bernini was approaching 60. He commanded a small army of sculptors, specialists, and workmen, which allowed him to concentrate on the models and the designs for project after project. And these included the Cathedra Petri and the design for St. Peter's Square, which I mentioned before. He designed the angels which adorn the Ponte Sant'Angelo, or Bridge of Holy Angels, which spans the Tiber River in Rome. The magnificent portrait bust of the French king Louis XIV, another fountain for Piazza Navona called the Fountain of the Moor, and many others. His career spanned 5 popes, and the tomb of Pope Alexander VII, the pope who succeeded Innocent X, was to be Bernini's final commission, finished when Bernini was 80 years old. Gianlorenzo Bernini died at the age of 82. So that's his life and career in a nutshell. Bernini's work is so diverse, so significant, and there's just so much of it that to just sketch it briefly still takes half an hour. Several of the works that I've mentioned I will go into more detail next week, but this week I just wanted to give you an overview of his life and also to talk about his important early works. Remember the ones that I mentioned, the ones he made for Cardinal Borghese, the David, the Pluto and Persephone, the Apollo and Daphne. I want to talk about those and how they put into motion that which would become Baroque sculpture. when the sculptor's funeral continues. Hey there, podcast listeners. If you are like me, you enjoy hearing about the lives of sculptors almost as much as seeing their work. And if you have an interest in learning more about the more colorful aspects of Bernini's personal life, like just what the heck was going on with Bernini and his mistress Costanza and his brother, I have got a book for you. It is called Bernini's Beloved, A Portrait of Costanza Piccolomini by Sarah McPhee. And better yet, it's available at audibletrial.com/sculpt as an audiobook. Best of all, it is yours to listen to for free if you sign up for a free 30-day trial subscription to audible.com. Now, with a subscription to Audible, you get an audiobook of your choice delivered right to your computer or MP3 player or tablet or smartphone or even your web-enabled car. You can listen to audiobooks on your commute, at home, wherever you go. And if you sign up for the free trial at audibletrial.com/sculpt, you will be actively supporting the Sculptor's Funeral podcast, as well as improving your mind with audiobooks. You can listen to works of fiction, nonfiction, history, bestsellers, and much more. So for your free trial, go to audibletrial.com/sculpt. And thanks for supporting the podcast. All right, let's go back to the beginning a bit, to the several large sculptures commissioned by the Cardinal Scipione Borghese from the young Gianlorenzo Bernini, starting with Pluto abducting Proserpina, or more commonly, Pluto and Persephone. It's actually a three-figure group. There's Pluto striding forward with a struggling Persephone in his arms and pressed to his chest as she squirms to escape his grasp. But there's also a vicious, three-headed dog, Cerberus, nipping at her feet. Compositionally, it's a lot like Bernini's first group, The Flight from Troy. The three-headed dog, Cerberus, is in the same relative position as Aeneas's son, who strides beside Aeneas. And like The Flight of Troy, Pluto and Persephone owe a big debt to John Bologna and his work, The Rape of a Sabine. The firm hand of Pluto sinking into Persephone's thigh is often remarked upon, but it was a passage that Bernini learned from The Rape of a Sabine. Same goes for the general figure of Persephone, who twists away from Pluto with her arm raised in a manner very similar to the Sabine. But it is so much more than just a riff on John Bologna's work. For one thing, Pluto and Persephone, it's just so well carved. Bernini's handling of the figure of Pluto, in my opinion, surpasses any rendering of a male nude up to that point. It seems to owe its inspiration equally to the antique, close study of anatomy, and also study of living models. There is attention to accurately observe detail in this and in most of Bernini's early work, which stands in contrast to the simplified and unified forms one finds in more idealized work. The character of various wrinkles of the skin, the character of dog's flesh. Bernini even accurately renders the ridges on the roof of the dog monster's mouth. Nothing is left to chance or passed over as insignificant. All the detail is fully rendered. And then there's the composition, which I said owes much to John Bologna, but it doesn't owe everything to John Bologna. If you recall, John Bologna's work was often designed to be seen from all angles. I mentioned this earlier. This concept was part of an evolution from the niche figures of the late Gothic era, which were designed to be seen from just one angle. And then this gave way to figures in the round, which still had a primary viewing point, such as the Davids of Donatello and Michelangelo. Now, John Bologna and the Mannerists devoted a lot of energy to creating compositions which seemed to have no primary viewing point. They were both beautiful and legible, understandable, from many points of observation. Now, that would seem to be the final frontier, right, in sculpture when it comes to composition. But many scholars believe that with the Pluto and Persephone, Bernini took ideas of composition in a different direction. For one thing, the Pluto and Persephone and the other works made for Cardinal Borghese were never meant to be seen from all angles. The sculptures were in fact meant to be placed against walls so that viewers would be unable to see them completely in the round. But if you go to the Villa Borghese today, you will see the sculptures placed in the centers of their rooms, but this is not where they were meant to go. It's nice. I mean, you can walk around the backs of the statues and see for yourself that these works have markedly inferior viewpoints from certain angles, as they were not meant to be designed to be seen that way. So anyway, if you're Bernini, it would seem more sensible to design the works from a single viewpoint. So then the question becomes, what are the primary viewpoints of these statues? Now, usually the primary viewpoint for a work designed to be understood in a single glance is obvious. The main viewpoint will be the one point of view where the entire message of the sculpture is legible. Often the design of the plinth or the pedestal on which the sculpture stands will subconsciously direct the viewer towards the correct viewpoint. For instance, a nice square pedestal might indicate on the front plane of the pedestal an inscription or a cartouche, right? So you kind of, are naturally drawn to the front because the title of the sculpture will be in the position where you're meant to see the sculpture. But with the Pluto and Persephone, as well as the David and the Apollo and Daphne, historians and scholars tended to disagree as to what might be the primary viewpoint of each statue. Taking the Pluto and Persephone. Now, we can generally agree where the front of the statue may be. Now, we can stand in one place in the room, and in a single glance, we can take in Pluto, laughing at the struggling Persephone, with the three-headed dog menacing at her feet. We could call that the front. But there's a problem. To get to the front of the statue, we first have to approach the statue from either side. You see, there are two doors that get us into the room where the statue is displayed. The front of the statue is not facing either door, although it could easily be placed to face one door or the other. Instead, our first impression of the statue is of one side or the other, depending on which door we enter, rather than what would seem to be the main viewpoint. And thus the first impressions we get of the statue, depending on through which door we enter, are very, very different. Consider what we see if we enter from what might be thought of as the Pluto side of the sculpture, right? So at first glance, we see a large Hercules-type figure with the form of a woman in his arms. One of the woman's hands is thrown up in the air, but it's hard to tell if it's in struggle or in delight. We don't see the woman's face, but we can clearly see the male figure striding forward with a big grin on his face. Cerberus, the vicious three-headed dog, is nowhere to be seen from this side. It's completely hidden. So going on the impression of this view alone, the statue could easily be a satyr and a bacchante rather than a scene of an abduction. But if we approach through the other door on the Persephone side of the statue, we see a completely different picture. We don't see much of Pluto's head or even of his body, but we do see Persephone pushing against him forcefully. And we also see Persephone's face, mouth open in a scream with an expression of terror in her face. We see her body constrained by two powerful arms and dangled above the snapping jaws of a three-headed dog. There is little room for interpretation outside of themes of horror and struggle. So, two different first impressions, depending on how you approach the statue. It's almost like taking sides in an argument. One literally sees Pluto's point of view in the work if you approach from Pluto's side, and Persephone's point of view when approaching from the other side. And it's only when one travels at least halfway around the sculpture does one get the full story. In other words, the full impact of the work isn't from a primary viewpoint, but from a succession of viewpoints over time. The sculpture's theme unfolds as you walk around it. Now, this is very different from, say, John Bologna's Rape of a Sabine. In that work, there's no story that unfolds, no change of narrative perspective from one angle to another. The genius of the Rape of a Sabine is that the story is clear from every point of view, but you really only need one point of view to understand it. Further viewpoints only provide additional views, but nothing which offers a different narrative perspective, like in the Pluto and Persephone. So, was this just a happy accident? Or did the young Bernini intend to provide this sort of chronological unfolding of the theme of his statue? We will never know for sure, but clues point to it to being intentional, as he seems to repeat this idea of successive viewpoints with the David and with the Apollo and Daphne. Another clue might also be found in the work he did just before the Pluto and Persephone, The Flight from Troy. It's a wonderfully complex and successful work in many respects, but one obvious weakness of the statue is that when one enters the room from the main door and sees this work for the first time, the small boy, the son of Aeneas, he's completely hidden. You have to walk into the room and around the work before you see him too, just like you don't see Cerberus, the dog monster, until you walk in a bit from Pluto's side. But unlike Cerberus, whether or not you see the figure of the boy, it doesn't essentially change the tone of the work. When you first encounter the flight from Troy, you see two people fleeing the burning city. And then you walk around it a little bit, and you eventually come across Aeneas' son, and now you have three people fleeing the city. It doesn't enrich the narrative that much, and it certainly doesn't provide a change in the narrative perspective. The fact that we can't see the boy when we first enter is probably accidental, and something that Bernini didn't take into account when he sculpted it. But once the statue was in place, it isn't difficult to imagine Bernini being unhappy with the deficient initial point of view of the statue. Maybe he realized his next statue, the Pluto and Persephone, which is essentially the same composition as the Flight of Troy, would suffer from a similar deficiency. But being the genius that he was, Bernini turns the potential weakness into a strength, where having a part of the sculpture hidden until further inspection actually enriches the work. So now let's turn our attention to the other statues that Bernini carved for Cardinal Borghese at this time, the Apollo and Daphne and the David. Now, the Apollo and Daphne is a figure group showing the god Apollo in pursuit of the nymph Daphne. Daphne doesn't want to get caught, to be seduced by the god, so she calls upon her father, who happens to be a river god, for protection, and her father transforms Daphne into a laurel tree. Apollo is thwarted. Now, almost everyone who has seen this statue is almost compelled to remark upon its extreme beauty and apparent fragility. The composition, first of all, is worked out in such a way that one could be forgiven thinking that it wasn't made of marble at all. Apollo is depicted in the act of running. He's chasing after the beautiful maiden, with one leg completely unsupported and off the ground, a hitherto unthinkable design for a life-sized marble statue. Daphne herself leaps into the air, arms outstretched, and in the middle of her transformation. Her fingertips are sprouting branches, and at the end of these branches, laurel leaves of utmost delicacy, some so thin as to be translucent. I have a lot of painter friends, and I've never taken a poll amongst them, but I'm going to guess that Bernini's Apollo and Daphne is probably most commonly cited amongst my painter friends as their favorite sculpture. I noticed this years ago, and I was struck at how many painters were drawn to this particular work out of all Bernini's masterpieces. I think I know why. It's the composition. It's an absolutely painterly composition. The poses and actions of the figures, the drapery, the flying mane of Daphne's hair, the illusion of flesh transforming into bark and leaves, the complete mastery over the architectural issues related to keeping a marble figure supporting its own weight, gives the work a sense of effortlessness and lightness unparalleled in sculpture. It seems as ephemeral and as atmospheric as a painted image. And when it was completed and shown publicly, contemporary sources all seem to be almost at a loss for words to describe the Apollo and Daphne. It was commonly called a miracle, a work scarcely imaginable, something which must be seen to believed or even comprehended. And I agree. It's hard to be superlative with this work. With the Apollo and Daphne, Bernini became instantly famous, as you might imagine. But it is worth pointing out that at least some of the miracle of the statue was supplied by an incredibly talented assistant sculptor named Giuliano Finelli, who was responsible for the carving of the superbly delicate laurel leaves and the twigs. Bernini had no problem taking the credit for himself, though, and Finelli left Bernini's employment in disgust soon after. Now, at the same time Bernini was carving the Apollo and Daphne, he was also creating his marble David. Statues of the David, we know that Michelangelo and Donatello and many others have made statues of David. They have become a very interesting means by which we might compare some of the greatest sculptors of the Italian Renaissance to each other. Right? Michelangelo's David, standing at the ready to slay the giant, is an interesting evolution from the Davids of Donatello and Verrocchio, which represent David after the fact, complacently posing with the head of Goliath. Now, Bernini's David is a departure from either representation, showing David not before nor after the battle, but at the very height of conflict. Bernini's David is twisted into a corkscrew of pent-up action, and his sling stretched fully out by his side, caught in the split second that exists between wind-up and pitch of his stone. David's expression is one of intense focus at his target. You can see that he's even biting his lower lip in concentration. The head itself is said to be a portrait of the young Bernini. Now, this choice by Bernini to represent the height of the physical action of its narrative is not simply a one-hit wonder. In the Pluto and Persephone, the scene is that of Persephone being dragged to Hades, not before or after. In the Apollo and Daphne, same thing. We see Daphne caught in mid-transformation from human to laurel tree, and Apollo is in mid-stride. Now, we, as modern sculptors, find it a little bit difficult to recognize this sort of caught-in-the-action sort of sculpture as incredibly groundbreaking, because we're used to images being frozen in action thanks to photography. But in the early 17th century, a sculpture that could realistically stop time amid fleeting movement, that was a very new idea. We can trace this idea back to a few different works that the young Bernini would have been aware of, notably the Hercules slaying a centaur by John Bologna, where Hercules has his club raised above his head a split second before it comes crashing down. Even more familiar to Bernini, though, would have been two sculptures from the antique. Now, the first one is what is known as the Farnese Bull. I mentioned this sculpture in the John Bologna podcast episode as being formative also for John Bologna. It depicts a scene of intense action, several figures trying to contain a rearing bull. This work, along with the Laocoon, which was discovered even earlier, both these works belie the notion of the Greeks and Romans avoiding scenes of violent action and just sort of sticking to poise and symmetry and intellectual ideals which Renaissance Florence and the Neoplatonists were so inspired by. Another Roman work came to light as late as 1611 and was actually bought by Cardinal Borghese in 1613, less than a decade before the same man commissions these works of Bernini's. It is now in fact known as the Borghese Gladiator, and it shows a heroic nude in an active, spiraling pose in the act of blocking a blow from some unseen adversary with a now lost shield. One glance at the Borghese Gladiator will tell you everything you need to know about Bernini's inspiration for the pose for his David. The relation between the two sculptures is a perfect example of how a young sculptor will often take up the challenge of beating the old masters at their own game. In the David, Bernini challenges not only Michelangelo and Donatello with the choice of subject, the David, but he also challenges ancient Rome with the deliberate echo of the pose of the Borghese Gladiator. And in their own turn, the action, vitality, realistic detail, and triumphalist spirit of Bernini's works would issue their own challenge to sculptors throughout Europe over the succeeding generations, though few would ever come close to besting Gianlorenzo Bernini, even these youthful works at the start of his career. These four works, The Flight from Troy, Pluto and Persephone, Apollo and Daphne, and David, they tell us a lot about the precociousness, virtuosity, and range of Bernini even at this young age. Bernini finished all these works by the time he was 26 years old. I can think of no other sculptor who completed so many masterworks at such an early age. Most sculptors never achieved this much in a lifetime, but by the age of 26, Bernini had established himself as the greatest sculptor alive, and had laid the foundations for what was to supplant the Florentine Renaissance and Mannerist styles with a totally fresh conception of what sculpture could be. the Baroque style of sculpture was, from the beginning, little more than Bernini's own style, and the Baroque would end up dominating sculpture in Europe until the rise of neoclassicism in the 17th century. Well, that should do it for today. I have a cold, if you can't tell, on top of jet lag. I just got back from my Christmas vacation in the United States. Had a wonderful time, and I'm exhausted. So I'm gonna cut it here, and I will continue with Bernini next week. We'll get into his later works and also into the idea of the total work of art, which is an ideal that Bernini pursued in many of his works later on in his career. So thanks again for listening, and I'll be back next week with more.